Dear friends, the topic of my speech: the situation in Donbass, and the course of the special military operation to liberate it from the neo-Nazi regime that seized power in Ukraine in 2014 as a result of an armed coup d'état. I address you today. To all citizens of our country, people of different generations, ages and nationalities. To the people of our great motherland. To all who are united by the great historic Russia. As soldiers and officers, volunteers who are now fighting on the front lines, are on combat duty, to our brothers and sisters, residents of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, Kherson and Zaporozhye regions, other areas liberated from the neo-Nazi regime. We will talk about the necessary urgent steps to protect the sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity of Russia. It will be about supporting the will of our compatriots to determine their own future. And about the aggressive policy of some Western elites, who try by all means to maintain their dominance. And to do this, they are trying to block, to suppress any sovereign, independent centers of development. To continue roughly imposing their will on other nations, to impose their pseudo-values. The goal of this West is to weaken, divide them, and destroy our country. They are already saying directly that they were able to split the Soviet Union in 1991, and now the time has come for Russia itself. That it must break up into a multitude of regions and provinces that are mortally hostile to each other. And they have been hatching such plans for a long time. They encouraged gangs of international terrorists in the Caucasus, they promoted the NATO offensive infrastructure right up to our borders. They have made total Russophobia their weapon, including the decades of purposeful cultivation of hatred of Russia, especially in Ukraine, which they have prepared to consider an anti-Russian bridgehead. And they turned the Ukrainian people themselves into cannon fodder. And pushed to war with our country, unleashing this war in 2014, using armed forces against civilians. By organizing a genocide, a blockade, and terror against people who refuse to recognize the government that emerged in Ukraine as a result of the coup d'état. After today's regime in Kiev actually publicly refused a peaceful solution to the Donbass problem and, moreover, announced its claim to nuclear weapons, it became absolutely clear that a new next large-scale offensive on the Donbass, as it had already happened twice before, was inevitable. And then an attack on Russian Crimea on Russia would also inevitably follow. In this context, the decision to preemptively launch a military operation was absolutely necessary. It was the only possible one. And the main goal of the liberation of the entire territory of Donbass was and remains unchanged. The Luhansk People's Republic has already been almost completely cleared of neo-Nazis, but fighting in the Donetsk People's Republic continues. Here for 8 years the Kiev occupation regime has created a deeply echeloned line of long-term fortifications. Taking them by storm would result in heavy losses, so our units, as well as military units of the Donbass republics, contribute in a planned, competent manner, using equipment, saving personnel and step-by-step liberating the Donetsk land, clearing cities and towns from neo-Nazis, assisting people, whom the Kiev regime has turned into hostages and human shields. As you know, special military operations involve professional servicemen serving under contract. The military forces are fighting shoulder to shoulder with them and with volunteer formations, people of different nationalities, professions, ages, and true patriots. In this regard, I have already given instructions to the government of the Ministry of Defense to determine in full and as soon as possible the legal status of volunteers and fighters of the units of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics. It must be the same as that of regular servicemen in the Russian army, including material, medical support, and social guarantees. Special attention should be paid to organizing the supply of volunteer formations and people's militia units in Donbass with equipment and gear. In the course of solving the main tasks to protect Donbass, and our troops, based on the plans and decisions of the Ministry of Defense and the General Staff on the General Strategy of Action, liberated from neo-Nazis also significant areas of Kherson and Zaporozhye regions. A number of other areas, which resulted in a long line of combat contact, which is over 1,000 kilometers. What I want to say publicly for the first time today is that already after the start of the special military operation, including during the negotiations in Istanbul, Kiev's representatives reacted very positively to our proposal, and these proposals were primarily concerned with ensuring Russia's security of our interests. But obviously the peaceful solution did not suit the West, so after reaching certain compromises Kiev was actually given a direct order to sabotage all agreements, and Ukraine started receiving even more weapons. The Kiev regime started pumping in new gangs of foreign mercenaries and nationalists. Military units trained to NATO standards and under the de facto command of Western advisors. At the same time, the regime of repression throughout Ukraine against its own citizens, established immediately after the 2014 armed coup, was strengthened in the harshest possible way. The policy of intimidation, terror, and violence is taking more and more masses of terrible barbaric forms. I would like to emphasize that we know that the majority of people living in the territories liberated from the neo-Nazis, this is primarily the historical lands of Novorossiya, do not want to be under the yoke of the neo-Nazi regime. Zaporozhye in the Kherson region of Luhansk and Donetsk have seen and see the atrocities that the Nazis create in the occupied districts of Kharkiv region. The descendants of the Banderites and Nazi punishers kill people, torture them, imprison them, settle scores, massacre them, and torture peaceful civilians. In the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics in Zaporizhia and Kherson regions. Before the outbreak of hostilities, more than 7.5 million people lived in these republics. Many of them were forced to become refugees, to leave their homes. And those who remained, about 5 million people, are now subjected to constant artillery and rocket fire by neo-Nazi militants. They hit hospitals and schools, organize terrorist acts against civilians. We do not have any moral right to hand over our loved ones to the torturer. We cannot but respond to their sincere desire to determine their own fate. The parliaments of the People's Republics of Donbass, as well as the civil-military administrations of the Kherson and Zaporizhia regions, decided to hold referendums on the future of these territories, and have asked Russia to support such a step. I emphasize that we will do everything to ensure safe conditions for referendums so that people can express their will. And the decision on their future, which will be taken by the majority of residents of the Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republics, Zaporizhia and Kherson regions, we will support. Dear friends, today our armed forces, as I have already said, are operating on a line of contact that exceeds 1,000 kilometers. To confront not only neo-Nazi formations, but in fact the entire military machine of the collective West in this situation, I believe the following decision is necessary. It is fully adequate to the threats we face. It is to protect our homeland and its sovereignty and territorial integrity, to ensure the security of our people and the people in the liberated territories. I deem it necessary to support the proposal of the Ministry of Defense and the General Staff for a partial mobilization in the Russian Federation. I repeat, we are talking about partial mobilization, that is, only citizens who are currently in the reserve and, above all, those who have served in the armed forces will be called up for military service. who served in the ranks of the armed forces, have certain military specialties and relevant experience. Those called up for military service will undergo additional military training taking into account the requirements of a special military operation before being dispatched to the unit. The decree on partial mobilization has been signed. In accordance with the law, the House of the Federal Assembly of the Federation Council and the State Duma will be officially informed of this by letters today. Mobilization activities will begin today. From September 21st. I instruct the heads of the regions to provide all the necessary assistance to the work of the military commissariats. I stress in particular that citizens of Russia and those called up for military service under mobilization will receive the status of payment and all the social guarantees of military personnel serving under contract. I would add that the decree on partial mobilization also provides for additional measures to fulfill the state defense order. The heads of defense enterprises are directly responsible for solving the tasks of increasing the production of weapons and military equipment by deploying additional production capacities. In turn, all questions of material and financial support of defense enterprises must be resolved by the government without delay. Dear friends, with its aggressive anti-Russian policy, the West has crossed every line. We constantly hear threats against our country, our people. Not only do some irresponsible politicians in the West talk about plans to arrange supplies of long-range offensive weapons to Ukraine, systems that allow strikes against Crimea and other regions of Russia. Such terrorist strikes, including those using Western weapons, are already being carried out in real time on border settlements in the Belgorod-Kursk region using modern systems of aircraft, ships, satellites, strategic drones by NATO reconnaissance throughout its Russia. Washington, London, and Brussels are directly pushing Kiev to transfer hostilities to our territory. They are already openly saying that Russia must be defeated by all means on the battlefield, followed by the deprivation of political, economic, cultural, and any kind of sovereignty. With complete looting of our country. It is not only about the shelling of the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, encouraged by the West, which threatens an atomic catastrophe, but also about the statements of some high-ranking representatives of leading NATO states about the possibility and admissibility of using nuclear weapons of mass destruction against Russia. To those who make such statements about Russia, I would like to remind you that our country also has various means of destruction, and some components are even more modern than those of NATO countries. And when the territorial integrity of our country is threatened, we will certainly use all the means at our disposal to defend Russia and our people. This is not a bluff. Russian citizens can be sure that the territorial integrity of our homeland, our independence and freedom will be ensured. Let me stress this with all the means at our disposal. Those who try to blackmail us with nuclear weapons must know that the winds may blow in their direction. It is our historical tradition to stop those who seek world domination, who threaten to dismember and enslave our homeland. Will we do it now? We will. I believe in your support.